The People's Garden Project, a community garden funding opportunity. The People's Garden Project is a community garden funding opportunity through a collaborative effort between the Rhode Island Conservation Districts, Northern, Southern, and Eastern, the Rhode Island State Conservation Committee, RISCC, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, USDA NRCS. The People's Garden Project allocates funding to eligible organizations and entities that are developing new projects within new or existing community gardens to support local food access. Please note that the conservation districts are not part of NRCS, but rather a quasi-public organization that assists NRCS and other federal, state, local, and private organizations and entities that support agriculture, water conservation, forest management, and environmental conservation practices on a local level. The conservation districts are non-regulatory, non-enforcement organizations that are here to help people help themselves, care for, restore, and become stewards of our natural resources. Each of the Rhode Island Conservation Districts seeks applicants to fund community garden projects through the People's Garden Project. Funding can be spent on items such as garden materials, tools, soil and soil additives, fertilizers, seeds, irrigation materials, high tunnels, lumber, pollinator plants, and much more. Although funding cannot be used to maintain existing gardens, it may be used to create new garden beds at a site where other gardens already exist. Each garden system must have an irrigation system. It need not be complex. An outdoor spigot with a hose on it would qualify. Agreement funds may be used for the installation of the system. A maximum of $500 for small projects or $1,000 for larger projects should be budgeted for a combination of irrigation and fencing. For example, $500 for irrigation and $500 for fencing to total $1,000. The use of raised beds and imported soil is required for a site where soil is contaminated. Raised beds may also be used to increase accessibility. Agreement funds may be used to pay for these costs. Only temporary growing structures such as high tunnels or hoop houses can be paid for by funding. Your conservation district can help you if you are considering applying for a high tunnel or hoop house for your project. Funds may not be used for staff time and will be dispersed on a reimbursement basis. Staff time can count towards the match provided to the project, which I will talk about shortly. Once you're approved for funding and sign the agreement form with your conservation district, you are able to start your project. Your organization is responsible for the purchase of everything in your approved budget proposal. Keep track of all receipts, expenses, and invoices for your project. Your conservation district will provide you with an easy fillable form to keep track of all expenses if you so choose to use it. Once you have paid for your project expenses, you can send copies of your invoices and expenses to your conservation district, who will then reimburse your organization for those expenses. Reimbursements of any expenses not on your project's agreed upon budget will not be reimbursed. If project and budget changes are required, you must seek approval for project budget changes prior to purchasing or making any changes. You may submit project reimbursements as frequent or infrequent as your project may require. The People's Garden Project requires cash or in-kind match contributions of $1 to $1 ratio, meaning that for every $1 of funding requested, the applicant, individual, entity, or group must provide $1 of match contributions to the project. Match is the amount calculated by cash or in-kind contributions, including donations, additional grant funding, labor, or additional purchases provided or associated with the project separate from the requested funding for a grant or funding source. Cash match or in-kind match is not additional reimbursement or funding costs received by a grant or funding source. It is provided to the project as a separate supporting source by the applicant, individual, entity, or group receiving the funding. Match shares the cost and promotes sustainability of the project and programs outside the grant or funding source. Keep in mind, every grant's match requirement might be different. People's Garden Project in-kind match contributions can be labor costs for staff and volunteer time, either calculated at an individual's rate of pay or the current volunteer rate. Cash match is the additional purchases to support the project. Both cash and in-kind match for the People's Garden Project cannot be supported by separate federal funds. Additional support provided to the project over the required amount will not be reimbursed for the difference. Match for the project should be properly documented and tracked. A documentation template for match tracking and submission will be provided by your conservation district if you so choose to use it. To apply to the People's Garden Project for funding your community garden project, you can either complete the application form or submit your own proposal that includes similar information requested on the Request for Proposals, or RFP, published by your conservation districts. You can review the conservation district resources posted on their websites that include the RFP, application, frequently asked questions or FAQs, and an additional information sheet on how to develop your community garden project and apply for funding. If you have questions or need assistance with filling out the People's Garden Project application, reach out to your local conservation district for assistance.